Okay, so here's the repo from our solution. Let me actually also just pull it up over here so I could open it up in an editor as well. And let's talk a little bit about it. If we go into okay. So what questions do people have? This is the solution itself. I just want to bring up a couple of things before we go into questions. So one of the things that I think becomes very useful is being able to open up a solution and sort of work your way backwards as to what's going on with the solution just by opening it up. And sometimes it becomes a little tricky in terms of where you end up starting with that. I think the easiest thing to always do is to start with the things that have the least amount of dependencies. Usually, this ends up turning out to be what your data layer is. When we talk about our data layer here, our data layer here is this tweet bank. So one thing to, if you wanted to sort of find out what was going on in this application, you might want to go in and take a look and see what's exported from this module. Now, the fact of the matter is there's a lot of stuff in this module that's geared towards generating random data. And you might have experienced that when you ended up going in, every time you make a change, basically it would regenerate the data for you. Sometimes that ends up giving you errors that you don't quite expect. But for the most part, the only things that end up getting exported here are these three methods that allow you to add and allow you to list and end up allowing you to find. And that really is what your data layer is. So that's always a good place to start. Once we end up moving into actual persistent data storage and we end up storing our data in a Postgres database, we'll be able to go in and look at those data models, and that would be the equivalent of doing this. But I would say that if you're going in and sort of playing detective with an application, that's a good place to start. And then probably the second place to go and look would be your app, and see how your app is set up, see what's getting configured. And the third thing to do would go in and take a look and see how your routes are set up. So you have your app, which is setting up your routes. And really, when you look at this application, there's not a ton that's going on here from the perspective of the view of the application. In fact, if you look at these routes, both the slash route and the tweets route end up responding to the same thing. And in fact, when we end up drilling down, we can drill down one level to a particular user, and we could also drill down another level into a particular tweet. And if we went to look in our views folder, we're really just dealing with one page of our application. We have a bunch of logic in here that determines what ends up getting shown when we decide to show a form and that sort of thing. So what questions do people have?
In the non-checks config, right, there's a parameter that the object you pass in is no caching, but according to the documentation, it also has an express SQL app. I wasn't sure what that does, right?
Which line? This line here?
Right.
Okay.
So where you have no...
I'm assuming that what's going on here, and I haven't used nunchucks before, but just sort of looking at this, one thing I would assume is that one of two things. Either it's specifying that when you end up looking for views, it looks inside the views folder, and that second parameter says that the same way that you saw that example with Swig, that you don't want to end up caching the templates. Because if you cache the templates, every time you make a change to the template, you'll never end up seeing that change. Vince? Yeah, I can't really do all that much about it. Let me see if I can fix that. Yeah, tell them I'm sorry about that. Go ahead.
Are you going to, can you talk about the Socket.io part?
Very, very briefly. There's not that much to it, and we're going to have a whole workshop on how sockets end up working. This was a very sort of simplistic implementation of WebSockets, and I'll take a look at that at the end. But any other questions on the other stuff aside from the Socket.io?
Can you just go over
John.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you go over like the static again? I'm just a little confused.
Okay. So this is a very good question. So one of the things that you're often going to want to do is you're often going to want to go and you're going to want to return static data. Let me rephrase that. You're going to want to return files directly. Someone's going to request a file, and you're going to want to return that file. In other words, most of the stuff that we end up doing are either templating or we have node code. We don't return those files. If someone asks for our app.js file, we don't return it. Okay? But there are files that we just want to serve up, and they're called static assets. They're not changing. Okay? That's why they're called static. That's why these are called static routes. So what this ends up doing, this is a little bit, well, this actually works fine here. What this is doing is this is saying, hey, look, if you end up requesting a file, okay, the place that it's going to end up looking for that file is it's going to look in the public directory for this file. So it's basically joining the path, whatever the current directory is, /public. And so the way that you can actually see that working is that if you go under public, you have a style sheet here. And if you go to your layout page, we've got a style sheet that we're looking at here. And what you're doing, the way that I sort of like to think about that is that we are, I like to call it as mounting this directory. Basically saying, hey, look, if a request ends up coming in, I'm going to see if I can find that file directly in this directory. And you can see that this link, that file can be found directly in this directory. Right? If you look in the public directory, you're going to see that you could end up finding your /style CSS under style sheets, right? Because you have public and then style sheets, then the style sheet itself. Now, another way that this ends up getting done, and this is the way that I sort of like to do it, is that we didn't have to do this here. But let's say that we wanted to serve something up in our node modules folder or something like that, which I did at the weekend workshop. I ended up doing it for Bootstrap. In that case, it would look a little bit different, or at least the way that I set it up is a little bit different, which is you have the ability to put a parameter here, whatever you want that parameter to be. And what that basically says, hey, look, if any request comes in with a /vendor in front of it, what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to look in this folder. Now, if I wanted to do this with the node modules folder, what I could do here is do path.join, directory name, node modules folder. And what this does is, to me, it makes it a little bit clearer if I'm looking at my code, which static route I'm trying to access. Okay? This one basically says, hey, look, for any request that comes in, I'm going to look and see if I see that file in this folder. This request says, if any request comes in and it has a /vendor, it starts out with a /vendor, I'm going to look at everything after the /vendor and see if I could find it in this folder.
And the __dir name
Is-
that
it's-
placeholder?
The __dir name is the directory that you're in
So it
right
doesn't
now.
matter what, just place it.
Well, basically what you're doing is we know where we are, right? And what it needs to have is in the end, it needs to basically find that file. We have to give it the directory for where that is. So what this does is it says, hey, look, give me the path of where I am now, which is app.js.
So it actually points to something. It actually does something.
It's a string. __ directory name is the path to where we are currently. You know, things would be a little bit different if we had to maybe, and I saw this on some people's stuff, if you had to go up one level, then you might have to go from the current directory, .. up to another directory. You'll see that sometimes too. It just so happens that our public directory is on the same level we're at. So we don't have to go down. We can just go from where we are down to the public folder. But if our app.js was somewhere else, then we might have to worry about where that was.
Do you need to spec, if you're on the same level, you need to specify the directory? So I was able to
You know, I don't know if you do. I know at one point you did. And it might be that it could just be backward compatible. I think you might get away with just saying, hey, look, this is under public. But I don't know. I tend to put the directory in there and do the path to it. But it's a good question. I mean, if it worked without it, then you might be able to do it without it.
When you try to share your screen, you cut off.
Say it again?
When you try to share your screen, you cut off copy from CD. So just so you
Yeah, I know. I realize that.
oh, just a message.
Okay. I know. I understand. Go ahead. Tell me your name.
Tim.
Tim. Okay.
I do have questions about the delete. So,
This was another thing that people had questions on.
I saw it on the Slack, and I still don't get it. I mean, apparently we can use posts to finish the job. Even gets can finish the job because we were actually just manipulating db.js and then return something from db.js.
That's right.
So
You never really need to use a delete. You never really need to use a post. You could, if you really wanted to, you could probably do everything by GET request, although GET requests you couldn't send data from. So theoretically, you could get away with just using gets and posts. But if someone was to go and look at your code, and they looked and saw that you set up a route in Express, and you were actually deleting data with a post, and someone wanted to use your routes, it would be a very unnatural way to set up those routes. Because we like to create routes that we call restful routes, where if you look at the routes, they make sense. And traditionally, a post is used to create data. A put is used to update data. A delete is going to be used to delete data. And the problem that you have with browsers themselves is browsers have no concept of puts and deletes. So by using this method override and saying, hey, look, if a post comes in, it has to be a post. If a post comes in and I see that there's a query parameter on there called _method, I'm going to actually have it go to the correct delete. I'm going to look and see if there's a delete route or a put route. I don't think it was used in this project. But then again, I don't think we weren't doing anything other than posting here. So we didn't need it. But if you are going to do deletes and puts, and you are going to do it in a web form, you probably are going to want to use method override.
I actually think we did the concept of next quite well.
Mhm.
From the video, it seems like next kind of guarantees some sort of synchronicity.
No,
No?
not at all. In fact, the reason why you have next is that it gives you the ability to have things that are asynchronous. Okay? When you think about Express, Express really is nothing more than this pipeline of functions that end up getting called. Okay? You could match functions in the callbacks in the pipeline multiple times. Okay? It's up to you to decide when you want to move on from that spot in the pipeline. The best example that I could give you of this is that if I was to go here and do an app.use and put a function in here, okay, I would be sitting here from now until forever. I would never get anywhere. All you would see in your browser was spinning. That's all you would end up seeing. And the reason why you would see it is that this is a catch-all. I'm saying, hey, look, I want to end up using, another way to say this is called middleware, okay? What we end up putting in Express is a pipeline, which is made up of these different pieces of middleware, these different pieces of functions. And the order matters. So if I end up putting this here, I haven't even ended up hitting, let me make sure actually I'm being accurate. I haven't hit anything. I haven't hit even my static routes. I haven't hit. Every request that comes into my server will hit this. Every single request. And it's going to hit this, and it's going to stay inside this forever. and nothing is going to happen, ever. Okay?
Third parties like body parts are inside them.
Inside, that's a great question. If you end up seeing that you're doing an app.use here, okay, rest assured of something. Somewhere in that call, you're getting a function back. And that function is going to look very much like a function that has those three parameters: request, response, and next. And rest assured, somewhere in there, next is being called. Because if it wasn't, you'd never make it past that line. Okay? So it's up to you to decide when you want to call next. Okay? If we call next here, perfectly legitimate. It ends up hitting this, and it'll move on to the next thing that it matches on in that express pipeline. Again, based upon what? Based upon what the verb is of the request, and based upon the URL, and any number of other things too, right? Because if it turns out that it's just a static request that you're making for a CSS file, it's going to get handled right here. And guess what? Next ain't going to be called. Okay? Because if you went and looked inside that code for that static route, what you would find is that it's basically going to go in, it's going to look at that URL, and it's going to say, can I find that file in there? If I can find that file in there, I'm going to return that file. And if I can't find that file, I'm going to call next.
Yeah, so can you quickly just explain the concept of middleware and like what's on both sides?
Well, the only way that I can really describe it is to just say that what you have is you have what Express is doing. Okay, you could create an HTTP server and have you'd have to put all the logic in what happens on your server. You'd have to look at every request and see what the URL and decide what to do.
That's all middleware.
No, hold on a second. That's basically just using, when we created our server, by saying HTTP create server. We could create a server like that and not use Express. Okay? What Express does is Express is wrapping around that server. Okay? And what Express gives us the ability to do is to specify when functions end up getting called based upon matching a verb, like a get or a post and a delete, based on matching a URL. Okay? And what we do is we call these functions that we attach to Express, we call that middleware. Okay? I call it a pipeline. I think that's a better term for it. Okay? But any of those callbacks are called Express middleware. So they're just functions. They're functions that you don't call. You never call them. Okay? These are called underneath the hood by Express when they should be called based upon the verb that you use for the request and the URL for the request. And there's a pipeline. The best way to phrase it is, again, when I do this, what I'm doing is I'm adding a piece of middleware to my application's pipeline, and I'm adding it right at the top. It's happening right at the top. You don't see you see another app.use for logging, but other than that, this is pretty high up the food chain. Okay? That means it's going to get called very early on in the pipeline. This piece of middleware is going to get called early on. Okay? That means that it's up to me to decide what to do when that ends up getting hit. That's why I need to call next. So the order matters, where you put these things in. If I put that app.use all the way at the bottom, it's never going to end up getting hit.
So is app.use is middleware.
App.use allows us to add middleware or add functions to an Express application.
So app.use is an abstraction for...
App.use is a function.
It's a function, and then middleware is happening one layer.
Let's just see, it's a good question, and it's very good to sort of get the words right to this. Understood. App.use is a method of our Express application, okay, that allows us to add middleware to our Express application. Okay? App.use allows us to add middleware. Again, I think another term that makes me feel a little bit easier is the idea of having a pipeline. Okay? It allows me to add a function to this pipeline, which really is my Express application. Okay? If you want to think of middleware as being this specific function, as that second parameter in the app.use, or sometimes the first parameter in the app.use.
That's exactly what I'm trying to.
Well, that's fine. That's fine.
So is it all the parameters in app.use? Like that's.
One could make the case that this function is a piece of middleware that you're adding to your Express application. Nunchucks. If it's something about the templating engine of Nunchucks,
Doesn't matter.
I'm not going to be able to answer it. But
Okay. That like extent, it was kind of confusing why we had two separate HTML files.
you don't need to. I mean, you should. Well, why do you have two separate HTML files? In this case, not a real reason for it.
It was just like extra complexity for everything.
Not a reason for it, because you will want to have a layout file. If you had two files that were using the same structure, maybe a navigation bar, then it would make more sense. So in this case, you're right. I mean, if I had an index.html file and a tweet.html file, and in fact, I would maybe make the case also, when I see, just as what I would call sort of a code smell, when I see a lot of logic happening in a template file, I sometimes start to think, could I have just created another template? I mean, maybe this would be, instead of doing a show form, because we only do show the form when there's an actual tweet, maybe we would have a template just for a single tweet.
Sure.
Which I think it maybe makes a little bit more sense. But I think the idea here is, there's a lot that you could end up doing with these templates. But 100% correct. You don't need to extend anything. You just have one file.
I'm still just slightly confused on, I guess, the router part of
Okay.
setting this up. So in our routes file, because we've moved most of our main routes after hitting the
Yes.
index, we then need to set it up as a router part of Express rather than a regular.
This is totally arbitrary, okay? The only thing that this allows you to do is that instead of having a file that has a ton of routes in it, what this gives you the ability to do is to actually set up a separate router, okay? This is, in an application that's bigger, this code is not going to make a ton of sense at this point, okay? If an application was huge, you would probably want to set up different routes where, maybe you have different routes for products, or you have different routes for users, or you have different routes for whatever they are, widgets, right? In which case, odds are you probably end up having separate routers. You could have a couple of different routers. You can have a couple of routers anyway, but here, the one thing that ends up, that's very, very important to see here, is that this better return to me some middleware, okay? A router is considered middleware, okay? A router is considered middleware because the router will determine what ends up happening when you end up getting to that route. And what this basically allows you to do here is that if you look at and I think really most of the logic here is in this routes file. And the only reason you're exporting it as a function is because you want to access this I/O object inside of it. Because you want to end up using, why am I totally drawing a blank on this? These things are called a WebSocket, right? You want to be able to use a WebSocket. Here, you want to emit something from a WebSocket, so you end up passing that in here. There are other ways to do it too, but it's not uncommon to basically export a function. The most important thing here is that if you dig inside this function, what you're going to see is what ends up getting returned from this function. All the way here at the end is going to be this router, right? So this router that you ended up creating over here, which we can create this router, okay? And now we just end up setting up this router to say, hey, look, if this is just a slash, we're going to respond with all tweets. We're going to do tweets. I would think that probably a more common thing would be an app.use/tweets and have some kind of tweets router. But we'll cover that a lot more. This was not really about setting up necessarily RESTful routes. This is more about just getting the plumbing working for the application.
The
the router does is, I'm guessing it's a smaller piece of, instead of setting here const router equals another express, we're making
You couldn't do it with another Express application. You could only have one Express application. I mean, I sometimes think about it as, if you want to think about it, maybe you could think about it as a mini Express application in the sense that you will eventually be mounting this router to some existing Express application. The way that I sometimes look at this here is that, you know, here I'm mounting to my /route this router, okay? Because again, you know, the router just says, hey, look, based upon this particular URL, right, this is the middleware that I'm going to use. If you end up hitting the /URL, I'm going to use this one piece of middleware. If you end up doing /tweets, I'm going to use a different one. If you end up doing /user with the name of a user, I'm going to use this different function.
In the line where we go var process equals to process, no, var port is equal to process.env.port. That process, we're referring to the node process, right?
Yeah, this is just a way, and you know what, I'm going to have to wrap this up quick. I realize we're going way, way over time on this. So you're talking about, are we talking about in this app? This app, we didn't do it. You're talking about what we ended up doing for the weekend assignment?
No, in the Twitter.js video, he did it.
He did the same thing? Yeah, I mean, basically all this allows you to do is that you have the ability to, here we're hard coding the server, but you have the ability to pass a port or whatever other data you want to. These are basically ways of configuring this application. Because this application can run multiple different ways. Don't forget, this is just a program, but we can end up running it multiple ways by doing node and end up running the program. So you might, based upon where you're running it, you might have different configuration settings for it. And that ends up doing with environment variables, but that's a little bit beyond what we're going to look at. The only other thing, and I'm really not going to go into detail on it, is just the idea of the socket I/O. The only thing that we're doing here, and as I tried to explain, because this was, I think, kind of confusing to people, is that the only reason we are doing socket I/O here is you have to think about, you're looking at this application and your buddy across the room is also looking at this application. And you go and you end up tweeting, okay? You will see that tweet because we don't have a single page application, okay? What we're doing is we're doing a full post to the server and we're going to get something back. So that socket I/O is not for you, okay? That socket I/O is for your buddy who's sitting there on another page, and what you can do is you can end up emitting an event that user could listen to, and what we would end up doing over there is a little bit beyond this workshop, but basically we could take that information and either refresh the page, or we can decide to add a tweet to the list, or any number of things. But again, we're going to have a whole workshop on socket I/O.
And that line 45 is really sending the tweet to the console. It's sending it to the Chrome console, so you can see you're not sending it.
No, the I/O socket, you talking about the on line 45? Yeah. No, that's a WebSocket. You have the ability. People can subscribe to WebSocket, so your buddy has subscribed to your WebSocket, and you are emitting something to the WebSocket, and your buddy who's sitting there and is not touching his page at all will be able to see something.
Well, without more code, that's going on the console, correct?
No. Whose console? What console?
The other person's console.
It depends on what they're doing when they're subscribing to this event. If that other person is subscribing to that event and doing a console.log in Chrome, yeah, they would go on their console. If they're doing an alert,
I tested that in code, and if you have two screens, it comes up. If you have your Chrome console up, it comes out on the console. You have to actually write something to catch it, and
you can do whatever you want to.
page. That's what you
Yeah,
said, right?
I'm saying you can do whatever you want to with it. If you want to write something out to the console, you can. If you wanted to add a tweet to a list of tweets, you can do that too. It's really up to what you want to do to it. But there's absolutely no way that you can determine what's going to happen with that by looking at that line of code. This is what's happening on the server, and you'd have to look and see what was set up on the client. All right? Let me wrap this up. We went a little bit long, so let me stop this, and we're going to dive into